written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word.
So, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer, Courtney, and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum with you. This is a book club for lovers of the Word Made Flesh. It's Thursday, February 16th, 2023, and I'm Leigh Bortins. Tonight, we're joined by Michelle Earls, Regional Director North from Classical Conversations. Welcome, Michelle. Jennifer, yeah, there you are. It's hard on Zoom. Thanks for coming. Jennifer and I have shared our love for reading. So what's your favorite book in the CC curriculum?
So I'm directing Challenge 3 this year as well, and getting to get back into The Consequences of Ideas by R.C. Sproul has been so good. Just such rich discussion with the kids, and it's just it's one of those timeless and timely books. And so I just appreciate having the opportunity to dig back into it.
Good. Yeah, we'll be having that one as one of our book discussions in the future. But this month's book club highlights resources for learning more about classical Christian education. So we've taken a bit of departure from our discussion of fiction to discuss these books. So far, we've discussed The Core on February 2nd and The Phantom Tollbooth on February 9th. That was just some Valentine's fun. If you missed either of these episodes, you can find them on the Leigh Bortins YouTube channel. But tonight we're discussing my book, The Question, and next week we'll finish the series with my book, The Conversation. And I also remind you I host 2 other book clubs. To participate in my book club about nonfiction, please join me for Unfragmented with Kevin Novak as my co-host. Unfragmented follows Words Aptly Spoken at 8 p.m. on Thursday nights if you want to listen live. Kevin and I discuss a book a month rather than a book a week. And for those of you that are eager to see more of the unseen, join me and Kirsty Gilpin at 8 p.m. on Mondays for book discussions around the Math Map curriculum. And now it's time for our word hoard segment. Jennifer, what's the word for this week?
I like to wait for the chimes. Look at that. All right. So the word for this week, as you can see, is transfer. Because it was Valentine's Day on Tuesday, which is when my community meets, I deviated a little bit from what I was planning to do, and we translated 1 Corinthians 13 in honor of Valentine's Day. And I did not bring the English. I just brought the Latin. I told them, you've been doing this for a lot of weeks now. We're just going to see how we can do. And one of the students, we always kind of look for English, derivatives. And so he said, oh, look, there's the word transfero. That looks like transfer. And so we looked at what was next to it, and it was the word mountains. And so we went, well, that's weird. Usually we would say we have the faith that can move mountains. Transfer is a different verb. So we had to think about it for a minute. And it's really 2 Latin words, trans, which means across, and pharaoh, which means to carry. And so we just enjoyed thinking about it's a big faith that can move mountains, but somehow us thinking about carrying mountains made it even bigger. So just looking at that Latin verse really helped us think differently about what our faith can accomplish. So
I wish I was in your seminars. Just could hear these kids. Maybe you should videotape them sometime.
I think I should. They're lovely.
Anyway, so normally at this point I would have a card or letter from the box that I have of them that you're so kind to send to me. But I just got off a delayed plane and wasn't able to go home and gather all the things I needed. So we're not going to have Words Kindly Spoken, but please feel free to send letters to 255 Air Tool Drive, Southern Pines, North Carolina, 28387. And maybe I'll get to read some of them here on the book club. We particularly like sharing ones with the children, the ones that they send in. So let's begin. Feel free to turn on your camera and chat questions and comments at the bottom of the screen while our producer, Julie Melendez, includes your insights. So Jennifer, first tell the club about the process for writing this book.
Yeah, so we talked a tiny bit about this during the core book club, but this was really the first book where we got together and in a week tried to hammer out most of what ended up being the question, teaching your child the essentials of classical education. So we started off our mornings thinking about the 5 common topics and how we would apply that to different areas of study. And then in the afternoons, each person took a chapter and just worked on their draft and then brought those ideas back to discuss in the morning with everyone. And so it really was a great writer's week.
Yeah, we got a lot accomplished. And so I get the privilege of having my name on the cover, but really it takes a team of people to get a book out like that. So Michelle, the question makes extensive use of the 5 common topics and the questions that we would ask for each of them. Tell us about those and how you applied them since learning about the 5 common topics.
I love that it's something you can take outside of just a classroom environment, that these are not just academic questions. And so for our family, we use the 5 common topics in decision making. We might ask, one of our children, what would be the consequences or the even the circumstances under which you would take the car and go and do things, and what are the things that are happening that someone else might need the car to come back. And they're not just the 5 common topics of invention. I think they are 5 common topics for just having great discussion and doing life in community with people. I love that they give you a starting point. And I would say definition is really important. We've found that last Tuesday we did debate in my Challenge 3 class, and starting out with the definitions in that debate was really important so that we all know we're talking about the same things. And in our world today, in our culture today, definition can be muddy. And so being able to have clear definition with people when you're trying to have a conversation for real understanding, I think starting with good definition is important.
Yeah, I was just with a parent a meeting where I'm on tour this past week. That's why I had a delayed plane. And a parent pointed out that you want to make sure that when the students define their terms from a book, they're actually doing it from the author's perspective and the time period's perspective, that you're looking at it, not just looking it up in a dictionary, but really getting the gist of what the author is saying is more. How about you, Jennifer?
Yeah, I'm always thankful for just rooting myself in these questions ever since we wrote the book. So one of the ways that I delight in practicing them is having conversations with my oldest son, who's now almost 24. And he's starting to ask a lot of questions about various things. So we took him to dinner a couple weeks ago, and he was looking at some institutions that have become corrupt and sort of started to sound like, well, the solution to the problem is throw out all the institutions. And so we looked at some relationship questions, like what happened to cause these institutions to become corrupt? What happened after? And then we looked at, what if we did get away with all institutions? When are institutions good? When are they bad? So we kind of wove in relationship and comparison questions to help him think through that issue.
That's good. Did anybody else in our audience want to share a story about using the 5 common topics with their kids?
I don't see anything in the chat, so feel free to unmute and share a story.
Or put your note in and we'll get back to you later.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now Jennifer is going to ask me and Michelle some questions to warm us up for the book club discussion. So I'll give you time to think about how you use questions in your homeschool.
Yeah, so my first question is actually about the preface. So lowercase Roman numeral page 13, XIII, for those of you who brought your books, and it's at the very bottom of the preface. And there, Leigh, you wrote that this book is about restoring a model of education that teaches adolescents to embrace the tension between the relative safety and ease of youth and the struggles and responsibilities of adulthood. And I thought that was a great description of sort of those middle years with our kids, and wanted to hear more about what the goals that you and Rob had for your boys in that stage between childhood and adulthood.
Yeah, so a lot of the challenge A, B, and 1 literature is just good fodder for this this statement. So we had them read a lot of coming of age stories, and we read a lot of them aloud as a family. And a coming of age story is one where there's a child in a situation, there's a pretty adult level conflict, But the child's not on their own. They have loving adults and support around them, helping guide them through that conflict. And then there's usually a resolution that has hope. And so we were trying to help them read as much literature as possible, one for family enjoyment, two, they're just good stories, but also so that they could see without actually making bad choices and having the conflicts themselves, how young people would deal with things and how they would turn to their families in order to get the help that they needed. And, it's really an interesting comparison to youth, or they call it YA, young adult fiction today, where there's a lot of hopelessness and there's a lot of children left on their own to deal with these conflicts. And so one thing that's really great about particularly Newbery literature before the 1960s is that those books aren't at all like young adult books today. They have, they're exactly what I just described, these coming of age stories where the parents are always well loved and, responsible for the kids. So how about you, Michelle?
Just to piggyback off of the idea of those books, I love that they can read about those hard things without necessarily having to experience themselves some of the more challenging parts that we read in some of the literature, especially Challenge 1. One of the greatest conversations that we had in terms of bridging that gap from adolescence to adulthood was sparked from Pride and Prejudice, where our daughter asked my husband, how do I avoid Mr. Wickham? How do I choose a good husband? Because that guy's not going to be a good husband. And so that was just, I love seeing those things come out, the discussion that follows. And of course, there's the practical things. We're trying to make sure that they know how to cook and how to buy groceries. And we can't necessarily pick that up from books, but there are so many eternal life lessons that we can pull out of those to without our kids having to walk through the experiences on their own.
Yeah, and maybe some of our listeners or some of our book club members can share a book they particularly liked. I know I always enjoyed Amos Fortune Freeman, where there isn't so much a young person in conflict. He starts out as a young person when he's enslaved over in Africa and brought over, but the majority brought to the United States, but the majority of the book is about him as an adult. And I always think that book's a good one to discuss what are adult solutions to problems that back when we didn't have such a overreaching government, because it is called Amos Fortune Free Man, and it really just shares a lot of things that he did because he was a free man and how he helped other people to be free. So that's one of my favorite books. There's also books that I'm not going to share the stories in case one of you wants to, but I love it when the kids would cry.
Yeah.
Right. The books are so good. And so do you remember having one, Michelle, where they were crying at the end?
Where the red fern grows, right?
Oh,
Oh my
no.
goodness, we had to take a break because we were all ugly crying because it was a read aloud. I think it was when Riley was in Challenge B. Oh my goodness, and the little ones are there on the couch, and I'm reading, and he's crying, and I'm crying, and I'm like, all right, we got to take a break. This is
Yeah. So how about anybody else?
But to learn that lesson first,
I think you came in and out. Did I
do a
miss
frame
it?
of reference. Sorry, my internet's being funny.
Yeah.
You're back. You want to say that last sentence again or not? I think.
Maybe that'll help.
Yeah.
Yeah, try again.
There we go.
There's your
That'll be
pretty
good.
face.
Fine. Try that again. Your last sentence.
To learn the lesson about loss from a book instead, before they had to learn the lesson about the loss of a beloved pet.
Mm.
One of the ones that stands out for me is The Door in the Wall, largely because of what the title means. So you talked to Leigh a minute ago about how a lot of young adult literature today is hopeless. And actually you can tell that without even knowing what it is. If you go look at it on the shelves, every single cover is black without exception. I've done this a number of times at different bookstores to test my theory, and there's just a darkness there. But if you look at the stories we're reading that are uplifting, a lot of hard things happen to little Robin in The Door in the Wall. but he's reminded that God makes this door in the wall for him to do big things. And then even though he has some physical handicaps and he's lost his parents, he's able to save an entire town by just walking through that door in the wall.
Yeah. And so a question might be that they get from the books is when they want to say, why is this happening to me? They can, have these comparisons of a lot worse situations than they may be in.
I loved, so having two boys and a girl, I never said, okay, Lauren has her set of girl books that she reads. So if it was Pride and Prejudice or Jane Eyre, no, we're all reading it. Lauren says her most successful kind of fruit of all homeschooling is she came home from college one day and the boys were actually watching Jane Eyre on TV downstairs. And she's like, I have one. My brothers love Jane Austen. But equally Lord of the Rings or, it was just, I think it helps, when you're reading books about how women are or girls are and boys are reading that, they're learning how to relate, in this story and see what should they do. Do they want to be like a Wickham or do they want to be, Mr. Darcy or who was the short guy?
Mr. Collins.
Mr. Collins.
So
Mr. Collins.
Christy Dye, can I tell a story on your son?
Oh.
About Pride and Prejudice?
That's fun.
Oh yes, I would. Yes, go for it.
So when Christy's son was in my Challenge 2 class, he said, I don't know about this. I don't think it's a boy book because it starts off, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So he said, I feel like from reading this first sentence, this is not a book for boys. And then he actually told me later it was his favorite of that Challenge 2 here. And I'm always amazed by how many of the guys, including this past week when we were reading a love sonnet by Shakespeare, made comparisons to all those characters we just named from Pride and Prejudice. So there's something about that book that sticks with them, even the guys.
That's good. Yeah, and so we didn't really talk a lot about the common topics. We just talked about the joy of reading the book and the type of books that they are. And but it just gives you, not all books have to be discussed, right? Sometimes they can just be read. And that's another thing I think about our selection is there are books where there's not a need for a lot of questions. They're so well written and the conclusions are so clear that the children internalize the answers to a lot of questions just in reading them.
Yeah.
So. One thing that we did was when we made the Words Aptly Spoken series where we help parents who maybe would read books and not really know what kind of questions to ask. I just want people to know that we have that available and it's called Words Aptly Spoken, just like this book club is, because the literature we choose is just that. It's, it's the best of things for their children to be thinking about. And so for those of you that don't feel like you can just jump into literature, maybe you didn't have parents that read to you, or maybe the first time you're really reading these kind of books is as a grown-up with your own children, we do have resources to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now I'm going to read one of my favorite quotations that I often hear you say, even outside the context of this book, Leigh. And readers, it's the last paragraph on page 7. And it says, the purpose of a classical education is to ensure that one is never excluded from any realm of human endeavor. So what do you mean by that?
And let me give some background because I didn't come up with it. It's from a promotional video for St. John's College in Annapolis. So I like to give credit where credit's due. And I like to tell people that, anything I say, it's not original. I didn't make any of it up. I'm not a genius who thinks of these things on her own. I'm just a voracious reader and I never feel excluded from any kind of conversation because everything's approachable and accessible if you're just curious and have a lot of inquiry. And one of the things why that's in the book is we're trying to contrast the difference between this sentence where nothing's excluded versus where it feels like if you have an expert model of education or a tracked model of education, that you're supposed to be able to be good at one thing and only one thing. And so we refute that. Another way that you could express it is, there's this misnomer, I don't even know if people know proverbs and witticisms anymore, but there used to be a famous one that was a person was a jack of all trades and a master of none. But that was actually mocking an earlier colonial proverb that said a person was a master of or jack of all trades and a master of one. Because there's nothing wrong with being really good at one thing. It's when it makes it so that but when you have some sort of education or cultural attitudes that make it so that you don't think you should be able to be, that you shouldn't be good at other things, or you're not capable of being good at in other arenas. And we just reject that, because Paul said we need to be ready with an answer for anything anybody asks us about.
Yeah, that's great. Michelle, so you've been homeschooling your kids a while and tutoring challenge. So was there a realm of human endeavor that you did feel excluded from? And if so, do you now feel included in it?
Yes, actually. And it was through homeschooling and through God's sense of humor in giving me a son who loves math, because math is the place where I felt like, I'm more of a words girl. I like words, I like language, I like poetry, I like literature. Math was something that I could replicate. I think Lisa Bailey used the idea of Legos without pegs. I could rebuild the thing, but if somebody poked holes at it, it was just going to topple over in terms of formulas. And so math was frustrating for me, because I also like to do well at things. And getting into math with my kids and learning math classically alongside them helped me to see math in a beautiful way. And while I still don't necessarily love it in a textbook, and maybe the math map will change my mind about that, I love it because now I see it in nature, and I see God's fingerprints and the mathematics of nature, and I see it in music and in art. And that was classical education that opened my mind up to all the places that math lived, that I could love, and I could be a math person. And I can talk semi-intelligently about it now in those realms that I did really feel excluded from before.
So think about the book, Lois Lowry's Number of the Stars. And if you put Lois Lowry's Number of the Stars in our logic strand, where we talk about, where we study mathematics, what are some of the things that are mathematical about that book? Well, first you start off with just the title has the word number in it. And so the reference to both Abraham and numbering the stars and the number of the hairs of our heads. You can look at scripture and the way the word number is used. But as you get into the book itself, there is so much math that's being referred to without being referred to. And so for me, so where you don't want to feel excluded from is that you know enough about math to go, oh, when they sent the Jews onto the boats to cross the water to escape from the Nazis, you could only have so much weight in a boat. You needed the boat to make the distance across the water. So you had to know what kind of fuel or type of boat you were using. But there's just embedded everywhere the idea of number. And all of us are mathematicians, because I bet you when you read that book, you could very easily get into the ideas of the numbers of soldiers that were there, or the types of dollars that were being spent. Like none of that went over you. You grasped it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the intricacies of clockmaking, right?
Yeah.
I'm conflating stories now. So in The Hiding Place, right?
Yes.
That's another one where the math is there in the architecture of changing the walls to hide people behind them, and in the workings of clocks and all of, I didn't think about it that way, Leigh.
Yeah, you actually, that's why my position is everybody can like math. In fact, most people do. They just mistake mathematics with calculations.
And my favorite math from Number of the Stars is that something like 90% of the Jews in Denmark survived because of a few Christian families stepped up and did something really hard. And that's an incredible statistic for their country and their history, that they got almost all of them out.
Yeah, it's a wonderful ratio.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So.
Good.
It's good.
Good. Are we doing okay in the chat, Julie?
We are nothing there. I'm asking for some
Okay.
stories. Anyone have an experience?
Okay, well, I'll keep going and you just interrupt if someone wants to unmute.
I will.
I keep pulling out all of my favorite quotations. So this one's from page 9. I didn't get very far from page 7, but we're on page 9. The next to last paragraph on the page is this quotation from the Supper of the Lamb, which is one of my favorite things. And this is the quotation. Our response to loveliness is not always delight. It is far more often than it should be boredom. And that is not only odd, it's tragic, for boredom is not neutral. It is the fertilizing principle of unloveliness. So I wanted to hear, how this book or how classical education helps us respond with delight instead of boredom. So do you have thoughts on that, Leigh?
Yeah, so I don't know why I am the way I am. I can make some guesses at it. And one is that I had a mother who just really was curious about the world, and she made sure that she spent time teaching us how to be curious. And so as one of the things that she would do is we'd do our little adventure walk when I was in elementary school. And when I came home, we'd walk around the yard on a regular basis. And she would say, look at this daffodil, it's about to pop up. Look at the birds in the nest. Look at how green the pool is. Your dad needs to put some chemicals in it, right? She was just always asking us to look at things and asking us questions about the things that we were looking at. So to this day, when I'm outside and I just look around, I just can't figure out why people, don't think stars are interesting or clouds are interesting, birds. Like it feels like people don't get to see what's in front of them. It's too common to them. And so what I love about all you guys and the classical conversations and the classical model is I just meet parents everywhere who think it's really wonderful to go see not just another sunset, but to open up a peanut shell and know that no one's ever seen that peanut ever before. Right? There's so many exciting things about this world. And it is very tragic that boredom is the fertilizing principle of unloveliness. Because what happens if we're bored with something, we don't care about it. And then we're more likely to be harmful to it. And so whether you're asking a child to define the difference between two birds, or explain the circumstances for when a certain plant blooms and doesn't bloom, like 4 o'clocks. Why do they open up at 4 o'clock? So there's just so many, there are questions that comparison between well, I'll go back to birds again, but the various waterfowl or the relationship between, like you were talking earlier, Michelle, about the driving the car and the lessons that they had to learn, just seeing what's in front of you, what you're doing throughout the day is what I think is really important about Christian education in particular. And that's what I think successful Christian education does, is it teaches you to see the unseen, and it teaches you to appreciate that unseen designer behind all of creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, one of our funniest homeschool adventures was that the kids came running in the house one day when they were out playing with our next door neighbors who were also in our foundations community, which was, they don't live there anymore, but that was a delightful set of years to just have that closeness all the time. But anyway, they came running in, all the kids screaming, shouting, "You can't believe what we just found in the flower bed. There's a dead animal." I'm thinking, oh, great. So I go out there and there is a dead mole in my flower bed. And we had just read a book called "What Do You Do with a Tail Like That?" And it just talked about the different animals that had funny anatomy, and the mole happened to be one of them. And I just thought, I know it's dead. It's sad. I'm sorry. But it was also a gift to us to see one, they're normally underground, talk about seeing the unseen. And here it was right before us. And so we just stopped. And in fact, my next door neighbor's mother-in-law was over and she came out, and I just thought, here we all are standing in my flower bed looking at this mole and just marveling at what an unusual and interesting creature God had made. So fun things. So Michelle, do you have a story about how asking these kinds of questions or helped you in your house attend to something with delight?
I'd love to share about actually in the Challenge 3 seminar, just a couple weeks ago, the question that we started our math discussion with was, how is math like poetry? And it was a little difficult at first to get the students to grab onto it, because they wanted to just see math as numbers. And as we went through and defined, well, what is mathematics and what kind of mathematics are we talking about? And then what is poetry? And then we built our comparison chart of how they were alike and how they were different. And it filled much more time than what I thought it would. And they really got excited about it. And that's delight for me, is when I can get somebody to grab an idea and get excited about it with me. So to have that group of 9 kids get excited about the idea of math being like poetry, and I'd say there's probably a good mix of people who don't like either one, but they were willing to engage in the conversation much more than they would have been just working through a math problems kind of systematically. But then they could see the systematic beauty of working through it line by line, just like you work through a poem line by line. That was really fun.
So did you get to work on the opposite and how poetry is mathematical?
We didn't get, I mean, in building that comparison chart, we got a little bit of both sides. And so we talked about sonnets, and we talked about form and structure, and how you can have a free form poem, but is it more pleasing to have something that is structured and makes sense, or is it more pleasing to have something that's a little bit more chaotic? And it was just a fantastic discussion.
Good.
That's great. We did have that math and poetry conversation. I did not plan this, but I just have some poems that I bound for us to read and discuss when we have time. And we had time Tuesday to talk about a Shakespearean sonnet, which is "Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day?" It's kind of like
that one too.
The romantic poem, right? And then the facing page, again, not planned by me, was John Donne's sonnet about "Batter my heart, thou three-personed God." And so we spent time counting syllables and counting lines and looking at, what happens after the 8th line in every sonnet. There's some kind of transition word like "but" or "yet." So now the poet is letting you know, I'm changing the course of this poem for the next 6 lines. So we just had a delightful time talking about that math and sonnets.
We did comparison between the love poem, the sonnet 18, and then it was another John Donne poem that was kind of an anti-love poem, and what the emotions were in that. And it was again, really good discussion.
Yeah. Having that comparison in our class. So we talked about definition, that is the first common topic that we usually talk about. And then we've kind of shown some examples of comparison, but just looking at how those 2 poems were alike and different caused the students to think about the fact that John Donne used that conventional love poem to talk about his relationship with God and how he needed to be divorced from Satan in order to be betrothed to God, and how they are the bride of Christ. I just don't think they would have seen that quite as forcefully had they not just read a traditional love sonnet and then they read this one where Donne is kind of breaking the rules. So that comparison is so powerful. Of a tool.
It makes me want to ask a question. A lot of the tour this week, a lot of the parents are, or directors in particular, how do we help people stay in challenge 3 and 4? It's kind of that perennial question. And I realized that really the best question that I can answer back is, where will they ever get to spend 2 years looking at Christian poetry ever again? Don't miss it.
Yeah.
So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. We're still doing okay in the chat, Julie?
We are.
Okay, well, on my snail's
It's a
pace,
quiet group.
we're moving all the way forward to page 11. The quotations I pulled out. So you might notice the pattern here. Apparently I liked the odd pages. Speaking of math. So a couple of weeks ago, when we were talking about the core, we talked about the importance of a blank piece of paper and training students to write down their thoughts instead of filling out a worksheet or coloring in bubbles on a standardized test. And so I wanted to talk about a little bit different tool. So this is at the very bottom of page 11, for those of you who have your copy. And it says, the blank piece of paper and a well-inked pen become the main tools of the dialectic in academics, while conversations and questions are the main tools used spontaneously in everyday life. And I've always talked to homeschool parents about, one illustration I give of how what we're doing is different is you don't need a reading comprehension quiz. Praise the Lord, because you're going to read a story with your child and discuss it with them. You will know whether or not they, and also comprehension, not the main point. It's the kind of things we've discussed tonight that they are inspired to be a better person because they've seen that model, or they're inspired to avoid a certain choice. And so, so we talked about blank pieces of paper last time, and this time we're talking more about that dialectic and the conversations. So, sometimes it's hard for us to feel like that's education. So Leigh, what do you think about those everyday conversations that are educational?
Yeah, so, I just think back to my own school years and how it was just, for some people, it's just so easy to fill in the blank and to make a match. And, we talk about practicing for the test or taking a test and then forgetting it afterwards. There's very little that if it's all presented to you and you don't have to struggle with it, there's very little that you retain. And so a lot of us feel like, we're cheated with our elementary education and our secondary education. And part of that's because we were children and we didn't know what to pay attention to, possibly. It could be, one of those reasons, but just the whole form of it wasn't helping us to pay attention to what the things were that we knew, to self-assess and be able to say, oh, now I know something more. The problem is you get this balance. So you got too many current schools trying to get, third graders to be creative in their writing before they're really ready for it. And it's not that those children can't be creative in their writing. They can be very creative in their writing. But the things that they can be tested on, and all of them are, much more capable of doing, is thinking about things and words and ideas. And so the way they do that, the easiest way is through stories and nursery rhymes and science projects and activities. And so it's those everyday conversations for the little kids that make it so that that dialectic is starting earlier. And then the other thing is, it takes time for a little child to be creative compared to what they could do. They can write quicker, spell better when they're older. And so sometimes you want to spend time as a parent judging, what am I going to spend my time on? And so if I was going to have my kids, really close to me and trying to think about academic skills, I would do things that I knew that were easy for them to do, that were super efficient for them to do. But I had to always balance that with, now, okay, let's get on the couch and read a book, or let's go outside and look at some things, to show them that there's places for a breadth of questions and experiences. And there was a need to practice very specific skills. And normally those aren't academic skills when they're in elementary school. Normally it was physical body skills, learning how to control their pen on their paper and look up and down from one book to another, or from a board to their paper. So it's not that the idea of giving them, grammatical activities is a bad thing. It's a sad thing when that's the only type of education they have. So that blank piece of paper to fill, as well as those spontaneous conversations, are a way to help you assess throughout their lives how they're doing and what are they learning. Where are they in their spiritual lives too?
Yeah, that's one of the delights of it, isn't it? Is just knowing right where they are and what their thoughts are and emotions. And how about you, Michelle?
I think something that parents struggle with, especially as their children get older, is how am I making sure that they're doing all the work, that they're reading all of the books.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe they don't have to do all the books. Maybe they don't have to read all of it, because so much of what we're reading and learning about is just human experience. And so being able to welcome a student into a conversation, or welcome one of my own children into a conversation where they haven't read the book yet, or they haven't studied that particular Latin passage yet, they haven't learned about the history of it, but drawing them into the conversation to ask about those universal truths has been one of the things that I've enjoyed the most, especially as they get older and they have a little bit more experience in life and can contribute. So having our adult kids come back home and sit around the table with the one who's still at home and learning, and just watching all of that interaction, it's educational, but it's so relationally fulfilling too. It's solidifying those relationships because we have common experience, and it doesn't have to be that you've read the whole book always. So
Yeah.
Yeah,
So one thing I'm always struck by as I meet challenge students in particular across the country is they come up and they ask me a question. And even though I've never in my life met them before, I have so much context for what the question is and where it came from. And like I'll be in a room with 100 parents and maybe the handful of challenge students that have come along with them. And this past week, I was thinking about how they could have asked anybody in this room the question they have, not just me. And that it's such a sign that the community, when your conversations don't need a lot of backstory, when you can just jump right into them. And so it's just, but that exists because the students were working on concrete assignments also, whether they were conversational or whether they were, get your paper out and do this activity.
Yeah. And sometimes too, I just want to say a word of encouragement, because although we do a lot of education when they're in these years through conversation that we have with them, sometimes they can't have the conversation. So I asked my little Mia, who's 14, she's in Challenge B. And I asked her about a short story, The Redheaded League, that they read in Challenge B, because it happens to be one of my favorites. And I happen to be the person who chose it for the anthology. And so I wanted to have this great conversation with her. And when I asked her about it, she said, I did not know what was going on in that story, which is a little bit unusual for her. And then I just remembered, his language is kind of hard. So let's do this. Over lunch today, we're going to sit down and I want you to read it aloud to me. And so whenever she got to a really big word like imperiled, he imperiled the mission, then we just stopped and said, what does that mean? Imperiled? What does it sound like? And so we were able to first start with that. We had to back up. In other words, we couldn't really have a conversation about how great of a story it was, or what a genius plot it was, or what the characters were like, because we just needed to back up and understand what were the words in this story. And then after we got over that hump, we could have a conversation about it. And so sometimes we just need to back up a little. They are children.
They are. So listen, before we go on, I want to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have an entire 2023 Words Out the Spoken Books Club calendar. That's at leighbortins.com with the Zoom link for the book club. And just show up, even if you haven't read the book, we may convince you to read it in the future. Next week's book club is on Thursday, February 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we'll discuss The Conversation by me and my team. So it's really fun to have people who helped write it here with the discussion. Okay, Jennifer, continue.
Well, we only have about 2 minutes, so I want to see if I can get you book clubbers going here. So have your kiddos asked you a really big question, like, what is justice? What is freedom? What is courage? What is virtue? Should I go out with my friends to this thing? Any of those things. So share a question maybe that your kids have asked you as we're winding up here. That made me think you had one, Julie.
No, I could share one. I'm not going to share the one that I thought of, because I was just saying, if you don't want to talk, you can just type it in and I'll read it for you. But I think one of the biggest questions I will say is, is God good when bad things happen? And that was asked 6 years after Challenge. And I was able to help my daughter recall, he is. And where have you seen him? And it was asking these questions, what are his promises and what have you seen him do through literature, through experience, through our family, through other families. And it really is about the questions and the conversations that you had, as opposed to the, Latin conjugations that you memorized. All that is good, but it's these questions that come back up when they're adults. So.
Okay, and Lydia, boy, can God think about anything if he already knows everything? I am to be thinking about that all year long.
Oh my goodness.
I know. And
asked by a 10-year-old.
I know. One of my students asked last week if God has free will. And I was like, anyway, that led us off into a multifaceted conversation. It looks like
Sherry.
Oh, go ahead.
I love that.
Yeah, that question came up when you guys were talking about Number the Stars. It was, I got the privilege of tutoring 10, 11, 10, 12-year-old boys in Challenge A. And so we were talking about that being courageous. And one young man who was always very quiet and very thoughtful just said, you know, I'm expected as a young man to be brave, to be courageous, and I don't want to be. And to feel safe in a group of 9 other young men at that age to say that and to have that conversation was just remarkable to me. It brought me to tears because I don't think there's other places that a young man that age would have felt safe to ask that question and wrestle with it and to think about it in a way, what it is to grow to a man who would be courageous, and he is now. But those questions just give you pause.
Yeah.
That's a
And
good
so
one.
many of the books they read address that very thing, don't they? That how can I be courageous when I'm afraid? So I love that. I think we may have to stop there. How are we doing on time, Julie? I think
Yeah,
that
we're
might.
good. It is 1 minute over.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
that was a good way to end, Sherry. Thank you. Go ahead, Leigh.
Yeah, have that, our men be courageous. So we enjoyed spending this time with you. Keep the conversation going, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.